Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we stir the pot just enough to annoy half the audience and amuse the rest. Today, we plunge headfirst into the claim that Christianity's greatest hits, virgin births, resurrections, divine cameos, might not exactly hold up under a historian's microscope. Instead, the argument says they're more a creative writing project than a divine instruction manual. Shocking, maybe. Controversial, definitely. Entertaining.
Oh, absolutely.
That's why you're here. And while you're pondering whether faith is fact or just footnotes gone wild, don't forget, this is The Deep Dive, the podcast that delivers messy, fascinating truths with a wink. Okay, let's unpack this. So for this deep dive, we're looking at a set of, well, pretty bold claims from the YouTube channel Witness of the End.
Right, they make this assertion right up front. Christianity was built on 10 of the most audacious lies ever told. That's their framing.
It's definitely provocative. Our mission today is basically to walk you through the arguments and the evidence they present for each one. We're exploring their perspective.
Exactly. We're looking at how they build their case.
And they kick things off with what they call lie number one. The claim that Jesus was born in Bethlehem.
Yeah, and what's interesting here, as the source points out, is just how deeply ingrained that Bethlehem story is. You know, Joseph and Mary, the Roman census.
The whole manger scene, it's iconic.
Totally. But Witness of the End argues that if you look at the actual historical records, well, they contradict this.
How so?
Their main point is there's just no evidence of any Roman census demanding people go back to ancestral towns, especially not, 1,000 years back.
Right, that does sound a bit impractical.
The channel calls it unprecedented, illogical, and entirely inconsistent with how Roman censuses apparently work. They taxed people where they lived, basically.
Okay, so why invent that story then? What's the source's explanation?
They argue it's all about prophecy. The Hebrew book of Micah says the Messiah comes from Bethlehem.
Ah, but Jesus was known as being from Nazareth.
Exactly. So according to Witness of the End, the story had to be twisted to make it fit. They claim Matthew and Luke basically made up different, even conflicting stories just to get Mary physically to Bethlehem. And this leads to a key question the source raises. Why don't the earliest Christian writings mention Bethlehem?
Like Mark's gospel.
Right, Mark, the earliest gospel doesn't mention it. And Paul's letters, written even earlier, maybe only 20 years after Jesus supposedly lived.
Yeah.
Nothing about Bethlehem.
And Paul doesn't mention a virgin birth either, does he?
No, he doesn't. The source sees this silence as pretty strong evidence that these narratives weren't original. They were added later, perhaps, as the story evolved.
Okay, that's a strong challenge to the birth location. And it flows right into what the source labels lie number two, the fabricated genealogies of Jesus.
Yeah, the genealogies. The source really highlights what it sees as, well, massive inconsistencies.
Like how?
Well, Matthew traces Jesus's line through King David's son Solomon, but Luke traces it through a different son of David, Nathan.
Okay, different branches.
But it's more than that. According to the source, they contradict each other on almost every single generation after David.
Wow. What about the explanation that one is Mary's line and one is Joseph's?
The source dismisses that. They state pretty clearly that the texts themselves present both genealogies as belonging to Joseph.
Right, okay. But the source points out a deeper issue, doesn't it? A core contradiction.
Yes, exactly. If Jesus was born of a virgin so divinely conceived, then Joseph's human ancestry, his bloodline, shouldn't really matter for a divine bloodline, right?
Logically, yeah. His connection to David would be through his mother, if anyone, or just irrelevant if he's divine.
But the Gospels, Matthew and Luke especially, go to enormous lengths to tie Joseph to David.
So the need to fulfill the Davidic prophecy clashed with the virgin birth idea.
That's the argument from Witness of the End. They suggest this theological knot should have been a huge red flag, but it was kind of glossed over. Prophecy seems to have won out over narrative consistency in their view.
Okay, that's fascinating. And it leads directly to what the source calls lie number three, the virgin birth itself. This feels even more central.
It really is, and the source's argument here is quite specific. They claim it hinges on a mistranslation.
A mistranslation? Of what?
The Hebrew word Alma in the book of Isaiah, the source says it just means young woman.
Not necessarily virgin.
Right. But when the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, the Septuagint, which early Christians used a lot, Alma was translated as Parthenos.
And Parthenos can mean virgin.
It can, but it can also just mean young woman or maiden. The source argues this single, potentially incorrect translation choice became the biblical foundation for a massive doctrine.
Wow. That's a pretty significant claim about linguistics shaping theology.
It is, and they back it up by pointing again to the earliest gospel, Mark.
Which doesn't mention a virgin birth.
Correct, suggesting to the source that the idea perhaps hadn't fully formed or wasn't widely accepted yet. It only shows up later in Matthew and Luke.
And even Matthew and Luke don't fully align on the details around it.
No, the source points out differences. Matthew says Joseph considered divorcing Mary quietly. Luke suggests Joseph never doubted her.
So the source isn't just saying they're minor variations.
No, they frame these as fundamental contradictions that damage the credibility of the whole story. They ask effectively, would the truth need this much creative editing?
Okay, so if the birth narratives are challenged, what about Jesus' public life? This brings us to lie number 4, which the source calls the most deafening silence in the entire historical record. What silence are they referring to?
They're talking about the complete lack of any contemporary, non-Christian historical record of Jesus during his lifetime.
Meaning no Roman, Greek, or even Jewish writers from that exact period mention him.
Exactly. Despite Palestine being, a Roman province under pretty close watch, with records kept for lots of things.
Even minor uprisings are figures.
Apparently so, according to the source. They contrast the detailed records of some relatively obscure events with the complete silence about this supposed miracle worker drawing huge crowds.
So their conclusion is
that the Jesus described in the Gospels is essentially a literary ghost, a figure constructed in later texts, not someone who left a verifiable mark on the contemporary historical record of his time.
that's a stark assessment. And it connects to the next point, lie number 5, the myth of the 500 witnesses to the resurrection.
Right. This comes from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, written around 55 CE. Paul claims over 500 people saw the resurrected Jesus at one time.
Which sounds like powerful evidence if true.
If true, yes. But the source points out the critical lack of any supporting details. No names of these 500 people, no specific accounts from them, no location, no date.
Just Paul's assertion.
Just Paul's assertion. And perhaps more damning, according to the source, is that the Gospels, written later, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they never mention this massive event.
500 witnesses seeing the resurrected Christ seems like something the gospel writers would include, right?
You'd think so. The source argues this silence from the Gospel strongly suggests the event simply never happened, and that Paul might have, made it up to bolster the new religion he was inventing. That's their direct claim.
Okay. Which brings us inevitably to the core event itself. Lie number 6, the resurrection. How does the source challenge this?
They start by questioning the empty tomb story. They argue it's absent from the very earliest Christian writings, specifically Paul's letters.
Paul talks a lot about the resurrection, but not an empty tomb.
Correct. The source says the idea of a sealed, guarded tomb only emerges decades later in the Gospels, like Matthew. And even then, the Gospel accounts don't agree on the details surrounding the tomb.
And Mark's Gospel, the earliest one.
The source emphasizes that the original ending of Mark is very abrupt. The women find the tomb empty, they're scared, and they run away telling no one. Full stop.
The resurrection appearances were added later.
That's what the source claims, that later scribes added verses to give Mark a more conclusive resurrection appearance, showing a deliberate effort to shape the narrative over time.
And the other Gospels add even more details, but different ones.
Exactly. Matthew adds guards. Luke has the unique walk to Emmaus story. John has multiple appearances, including Thomas touching the wounds.
But they don't match up.
The source says none of these accounts agree on the specifics. They call them literary expansions, not historical records.
So the core argument here is the lack of independent historical evidence and the internal inconsistencies within the New Testament itself.
Precisely. Why isn't the most important event in Christianity mentioned by outside sources? And why do the believers' own accounts differ so much? The source posits the resurrection started as a theological idea, a necessary climax for the religion, rather than a documented historical event.
And they connect this to other ancient religions.
Yes. They mention figures like Osiris, Dionysus, Mithras, other dying and rising god figures in ancient myths. The argument isn't necessarily direct borrowing, but that Christianity operated in that mythological environment.
Suggesting it survived and thrived, partly by crafting a narrative that resonated with those existing ideas, especially once it gained imperial power.
That seems to be the implication from Witness of the End, that it successfully adapted and outcompeted older myths by restructuring these powerful ancient themes.
Okay, this leads us to a broader critique. Lie number 7. The myth that the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses. What's the source's take here?
They assert pretty definitively that none of the Gospels were actually signed by the people whose names we attach to them. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John.
Those names were added later.
Yes, added later by church tradition, not by the authors themselves. And the source points out that this isn't some fringe idea. It's widely accepted by biblical scholars across the board.
And the dating is crucial, too.
Absolutely. The consensus is they were written 40 to 70 years after the events they describe.
So not immediate accounts.
Not at all. The source stresses this means 2 full generations of telephone game storytelling, political reinterpretation, and theological reshaping could have occurred between the events and the writing.
Which circles back to the ending of Mark's Gospel.
Right. The source highlights again that the earliest version stops with the women fleeing the empty tomb, telling no one. The resurrection appearances seem to be later additions.
So the question they pose is, does this look like eyewitness testimony?
Or does it look like, as they put it, literary editing designed to align the narrative with evolving doctrine? That's the challenge they present.
And if Matthew and Luke used Mark, why the contradictions?
That's another key point the source makes.
Yeah.
Why do they contradict Mark and each other so often on major details if they were just recording history?
What examples do they give?
Things like Jesus' first big sermon. Matthew has it on a mountaintop. Luke has it on a plain. The timing of the birth. Matthew puts it under Herod the Great. Luke puts it during Quirinius' census, which was about 10 years later.
Those aren't small details.
No. And even Jesus' last words from the cross, there are 3 completely different versions across the Gospels.
So the source concludes these weren't just remembered differently,
but actively invented, crafted, tailored to fit different audiences. They suggest Matthew wrote for Jews, Luke for Gentiles, John later with a more cosmic view of Jesus, each author shaping the story for their community's needs.
Okay. This naturally leads into line number 8.
Yeah.
Contradictions in the passion narratives, the trial and crucifixion accounts.
Yeah, the argument here is that if any part of the story should be consistent, it's this climactic part. But the source argues it's not.
What are the major disagreements they point to?
Key things, like how Judas died. Matthew's account differs from the account in the book of Acts. The reactions of the 2 thieves crucified with Jesus vary significantly.
And the timing again.
Yes, even the timing of the crucifixion itself. John has it happening the day before Passover, while the other Gospels place it on Passover Day.
So the source asks, why would eyewitnesses get such huge details wrong or mixed up?
Exactly. Their explanation is that these weren't eyewitness accounts, but narratives written much later by anonymous authors for specific communities. They might insert their own theological points or interpretations. The source uses the term religious propaganda.
Can you give an example of those different theological points showing up?
Sure. They mention how in John's Gospel, Jesus carries his own cross quite proudly, emphasizing his divine control. In the other Gospels, he stumbles, needs help, highlighting his human suffering.
So John emphasizes divinity, Mark maybe humanity.
That's the kind of distinction the source draws. They see these not as accidental slips, but as deliberate rewrites designed to fit evolving beliefs about who Jesus was. Layered interpretations, not raw historical data.
Okay, we're nearing the end of the list. Line number 9 tackles the myth of the early Christian martyrs.
Right. The source acknowledges the powerful image, people dying for their faith. The rhetoric is often, who would die for a lie?
It's a common apologetic argument.
It is. But Witness of the End claims that most of these dramatic martyrdom stories were actually written long, long after the event supposedly happened, sometimes centuries later.
So stories like Peter being crucified upside down or Paul being beheaded, no contemporary records.
According to the source, no contemporary historical evidence for those specific famous accounts.
And they offer counter-evidence from early Christian texts.
Yes, they point to writings like the DepDiv, which is like an early church manual, or letters from Ignatius, an early bishop. The source claims these texts actually show Christians living relatively peacefully alongside their pagan neighbors.
Which contradicts the picture of constant, brutal, widespread persecution from the very beginning.
That's the argument. The source suggests the dramatic martyrdom narratives were perhaps fabricated or heavily exaggerated later on.
For that purpose.
They call it the most powerful tool of manipulation designed to solidify belief, make doubt seem like betrayal, and galvanize the faithful by creating this narrative of heroic suffering against evil.
Turning faith into a battlefield, essentially.
That's the interpretation offered by the source.
Okay, and finally, line number 10. The myth that Christianity spread organically through grassroots belief and divine intervention.
The source paints a much darker picture here. They argue Christianity's spread wasn't just about peaceful evangelism.
What was it about then?
Imperial power, political alliances, and what they call calculated rebranding. Specifically, they focus on the Roman Empire.
The shift under Emperor Constantine.
Exactly. Early 4th century. The source argues Constantine's conversion, or at least his adoption of Christian symbols, wasn't primarily about spiritual conviction.
What was it about them?
Political opportunity. Constantine needed something to unify his fractured empire, a single, powerful symbol.
And the cross became that symbol, strategically.
That's the claim. Constantine used it strategically, then called the Council of Nicaea. The source argues Nicaea wasn't really about finding truth, but about ending the chaotic infighting between different Christian groups by standardizing doctrine.
Leading to the Nicene Creed.
Right. And this merger of church and state gave Christianity huge imperial backing. Power, resources, influence.
So the source sees this as transforming the religion.
Fundamentally, they argue it became a tool of emperors, leading eventually to violence, coercion, forced conversions. The Jesus of love and peace, they say, got replaced by the Christ of conquest and empire.
And they argue this imperial influence shaped the Bible itself.
Yes. Decisions about which books made it into the canon and which were declared heretical and destroyed were made by councils of men operating within this political imperial context, motivated, the source claims, by politics and solidifying doctrine, not just preserving original teachings.
So the conclusion is quite stark.
Very. They say it wasn't a religion rising on truth, it was a regime rising on narrative. They ask provocative questions. If Jesus taught humility, why gold palaces? If peace, why holy wars? If he rejected power, why popes acting like kings?
And their answer?
That the Jesus who might have represented those original ideals was effectively edited out, reshaped, and rebranded to fit the needs of emperors, popes, and kings. A challenging perspective, to say the least.
Absolutely. Well, that covers the 10 claims laid out by Witness of the End. A lot to think about there. Hit that subscribe button, share with a friend or enemy, and come back for more. Our producer, FireflyHaku, ensures this chaos flows smoother than a sermon with free donuts.
Grateful for your ears. Spread the word and join us again soon.